Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Habitchonistim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security-oriented policies to guide the state of Israel. We are a movement of more than 20,000 people, including many reserve officers and operators from all branches of the Israel Defense establishment. Thank you, of course, to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing so we can really bring you behind the headline and some analysis of what is happening here in Israel. I'm very honored to be joined today by Dr. Martin Sherman, who spent 7 years in operational capacities in the Israel Defense establishment. He's the founder of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies, a member of the Habitchonistim research team, IDSF research team, and a participant in the Israel Victory Project. Martin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for the invitation.
I'm going to make sure to put in the chat a link to your articles because whenever I read your articles, I always have a lot of food for thought and really appreciate the scope of what you write about. But I want to jump right in and talk about a hostage deal. You shared with me an article that you wrote many, many years ago contemplating the deal with Gilad Shalit. So I want to kind of pose that to you now. You know, the context is, every week, IDSF, we host briefings for the international diplomat community. And this week, the diplomats are from the US, China, Russia, Argentina, Japan, Morocco. A very wide range of diplomats came together, and their questions were very focused on what Israel's red lines are for a hostage deal. And this international diplomatic community wants Israel to push through a deal, but at the same time understands there are limitations. So I'll start by asking you, should there be a deal? Is that the proper framework? There should be a deal, but with limitations, or do you think there is an entirely different way of looking at the issue?
Well, I feel a little uneasy about dealing with this topic for a number of reasons. One, I served in a unit that operated behind enemy lines, and I've sort of been a heartbeat away of being captured by the bad guys. And I certainly would have hoped that they would have done everything to get me back if I had. On the other hand, I think it's a mistake, as harsh as this might sound, I think it's a mistake to let humanitarian considerations dictate strategic policy. I think the late Geulah Cohen, who was a member of Knesset, said something, I think very to the point. She said her son Tzachi Hanegbi, who today is the National Defense Advisor and served in the paratroopers, if he fell into enemy hands, she would do everything to try and get him released. But she would expect the government not to listen to her. I think you have to see the hostage question in the wider context, and the question is, how do you see the whole thing playing out, and where does the hostage question fit into the greater mosaic, to put it that way? I can understand and even perhaps identify emotionally with the calls for releasing the hostages at almost any price for the people involved. But that's certainly the wrong attitude for Israel, because everything that a hostage deal requires, whether it's a cessation of fire, whether it's stopping it altogether, whether it's releasing terrorists with blood on their hand, like Sinwar, who himself was released in the Gilad Shalit deal. That's the great irony, that A, Israel saved his life because of his medical condition, and B, released him, and he is now in charge of the greatest carnage that Israel has suffered for decades. So I think you have to be very hard-headed about this. And as I wrote an article which went against mainstream opinion with Gilad Shalit. And the title of the article is "He's a warrior, not a boy," because everyone said, he's our boy, he's our son, etc., etc. No, he's a warrior, and the deal with the warrior is that you put your life on the line to save civilians. If you have to endanger civilians to save soldiers, you're sort of inverting the whole social contract. So as I said then, I said we should do everything to release Gilad Shalit, but the release must be coercive and not consensual. And I think what we have to do here, as difficult as it sounds and as complicated it is, I think we need to do everything to release hostages coercively, not consensually. I think consensually would put other people's lives in danger. And I find it very difficult to say this, but I think that's the hard-headed approach. Everything must be done to release the hostages. They must be released coercively.
Part of your argument with Gilad Shalit is that he was a soldier, and a soldier is tasked with defending the country,
I
to defend
agree.
the citizens. Over here, we're talking about a lot of citizens being held as hostage. So does that change the equation, the extent to which the government should act for these citizens?
I think it might change it, but not enough. I think because you might be trading citizens' lives for citizens' lives if the terms of the agreement result in murderous terrorists being released and they take the lives of other citizens. Why do those lives take precedence over the current hostages? So I think it's an extremely difficult situation. I wouldn't like to be in the shoes of decision makers, but I said I think strategic conditions have to dictate strategy and not humanitarian conditions.
What is the greatest risk to a hostage deal? Is it this general perception of the weaknesses or the strengths of a Jewish state, its priorities, or is there a tactical operational concern?
Well, I think it's both, and basically you're inviting the next hostage taking. If this works so well, what's to stop them from trying another hostage episode in Israel or abroad? I mean, it's for them it's a winning card.
So if Israel does not give in to a hostage deal, your argument then is that moving forward, they won't take hostages because they won't see it fruitful, even though it's kind of their repertoire for the past, since the
Well, because
foundation
it's
of the
paid,
state.
it's paid off. There was one stage Israel resolutely refused to deal with with terrorists and release hostages, and then it came. There were a few deals, and that's we've just proved to the Palestinians that if you want something from Israel, that's the way to get it, and somehow you have to change this mindset. And what can I say? I don't know what I would do if I was in the hostage the hostage parents or daughters or son's position. But it's easier for me to be objective now. I don't want to sound heartless, but running a country is a tough business, especially in this neighborhood. And you need people who are made of the stuff that can do it.
Sure. Let's talk about Gaza. You wrote an article, and I'll share this in the link. The myth that the Gaza population is the victims of Hamas, as opposed to that the Gaza population was the crucible through which Hamas was born. Can you elaborate on that idea, please?
Well, it's Hamas didn't seize power coercively. They were voted in by a massive majority, and if you look at Palestinian polls, you'll see probably the same thing would happen if there was an election in Judean Samaria today, which is one of the reasons that Abbas is in his 13th or 14th year of his 4-year term. So because they're just too afraid to have elections because then they'll lose power. So I don't think that the population is the unwilling victim of the Islamists. I think that the Islamists reflect their innermost sentiments. And that's why I say they're not the victim, they're the crucible in which Hamas was formed and the incubator from which they emerged. And I think that with all the difficult scenes that you see of civilian casualties, they're the enemy. And I don't think that there's anything racist or fascist about identifying your enemy as the enemy and acting and treating it as the enemy. I mean, there was a quote from Madeleine Albright during the Iraqi war when the United States imposed sanctions on Iraq, and she was interviewed by Leslie Stahl on 20 Minutes, and Leslie Stahl said to her, we have a statistic showing that the measures that the US has imposed on Iraq has resulted in the death of 500,000 Iraqi babies. Do you think that was worth it? And the bottom line is, Albright said, yes, it was worth it. So you look at the way NATO behaved in Kosovo, and not one NATO nation was attacked by Serbian terrorists. But they bombed trains, they bombed bridges, they bombed markets, and this is the way that democracies behave in war. So, I think there needs to be a lot of pushback in the public diplomacy field by Israel.
So if the political and military entity called Hamas is just a product of Gaza society, once Hamas is destroyed, however that's defined, according to your logic, it's just a matter of time before another terrorist entity is developed. So what then is the long-term solution for Gaza?
Well, I've been saying this for a long, long time now. In fact, I think the first article I wrote about it was in 1992, which unfortunately indicates how old I am. But basically, Israel faces a cruel dilemma. In the long run, there will either be Arabs in Gaza or Jews in the Negev, but there won't be both. And that's not right-wing extremism. That's just sound political science. Because the only way that Israel can determine who will govern Gaza and how it will be governed is to govern it itself. And the only way it can govern Gaza without ruling another people is to remove the other people from the confines that it must govern. And as I said, this is not rocket science. This is just good political science.
I just shared in the chat this article that you're referring to from 1992, and it's I don't want to say it's sad, but it's a shame that what was so obvious in 1992 to you, we're still dealing with this many years later. But let me ask you, knowing the political landscape in Israel and the thinking of Israeli society, do you see this as an actual option on the ground in terms of picking one of the other, Jews in the Negev or Gazans in Gaza?
Well, first of all, there's been a huge shift in the overtone window regarding population removal. I mean, for decades, I've been advocating incentivized immigration for the Palestinians, offering them very generous relocation loans to allow themselves to extricate themselves from the grasp of these cruel, corrupt cliques who controlled their lives for decades and led them from disaster to debacle. Sadly, I think we may have been overtaken by events, because I'm not sure that you have the time now to do that in Gaza. And put it this way, if the Jews want their own nation state, they have to take the measures to ensure the existence of that nation state. If they don't, they won't have a nation state. And no one's going to be particularly concerned about that. I remember I heard a lecture from Yossi Cohen, the former head of the Mossad, about the Ukrainian war, and he said, no one came, no one came to rescue one Ukrainian infant, and that's how many people will come to rescue Israeli infants. If we do not do it ourselves, no one will do it. People will wring their hands in dismay for 2 or 3 days, and then there'll be a tragic mudslide in South America, and people will go and be horrified by the mudslide in South America. No one will do anything to ensure the existence of Israel, not even America. And so unless we undertake the steps that we need to, the Jews will lose their nation state. And to do that, to maintain a nation state, Israel has to address 2 imperatives. One imperative is the geographic imperative, so you have physically an entity that you can defend, and B is the demographic imperative, so that you have enough Jewish population to continue the Jewish nation state as a Jewish entity. And the only way you can do that is to retain the territory and erode the Arab presence. So I wanted to do it non-coercively. I'm not sure that we're left with that option anymore, in Gaza at least. I mean, I'm not very optimistic about Judean Samaria either, but you live in a tough neighborhood, and you can't be too tender. I remember once Amos Oz, the famous Israeli novelist, was interviewed by Ari Shavit in Haaretz newspaper on the Hezbollah, and the English headline, and I kid you not, the English headline was "Try a little tenderness." With Hezbollah, try a little tenderness, and good luck with that.
So, in that article, you kind of set up this dilemma, as you're mentioning, between Israel's security needs and the welfare of the Arab population. And you got to choose one. You can't have both. But are there models of success in Judean Samaria that we could hope for in Gaza? Or do you think the experiment in Judean Samaria is also not succeeded?
It will never succeed. It'll be simmering. But it was simmering the same way that Gaza was simmering, maybe a little different temperature, but it's simmering. They've never accepted us. They will not accept us. And I don't think anyone who is advocating a Palestinian state has the Palestinians' welfare at heart. I don't think anyone has wrought more death and destruction and suffering on the Palestinians than the people who advocated giving them self-determination. The people who've really, really brought tragedy on the Palestinian people are the people who try to foist self-government on the Palestinians. I think it was Albert Einstein who once said that insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different result. And elsewhere he said, you shouldn't try and solve problems with the logic that created the problem. And what's created the problem is trying to foist self-government on the Palestinians. And it's just brought tragedy to both, a bigger tragedy to the Palestinians than to the Jews. but anyone who's parading as a sympathizer of the Palestinians by trying to give them self-government is just exactly the opposite.
So let me ask you another hard question, and thank you so much for entertaining all of these questions. What we're talking about now, we could have had this same theoretical conversation in 1992, in 1993, 1994, meaning what you are saying seems so rational, but yet time and time again, we don't do this. We're optimistic as a state, and we hope that things will work, and they don't. And you'd think maybe October 7th would have been a wake-up call, so to speak, to just have this very clear change in policy, but that's not happening either. So do you actually see realistically any of these arguments that you're proposing that they would become policy now? What does it take to make people understand your approach?
Well, the only thing I can do is with the meager resources at my disposal is like the old kato, keep repeating and repeating and repeating until eventually maybe the penny will drop. But what has to happen to prove that it's not going to work? I mean, how many Jews, how many Palestinians have to die? Um, but in many ways, I think when Henry Kissinger once said that Israel has no foreign policy, it just has a domestic policy. And I think that was true about Oslo as well. I do not believe that the left really believed that Oslo was going to bring peace and security. I thought they thought that Oslo would basically make the right wing irrelevant. Because once you gave up Judean Samaria, gave up the settlements, what would be the difference between the left then and the right then? There'd be no difference. There'd be no rationale for the existence of the right. So I believe it was far more an initiative to neutralize the right than to bring proof. How is this going to work? How did they see this working? Really, I mean, Arafat gave us hint after hint after hint with his lecture in Johannesburg saying it was all a hoax. And you have to be almost infantile to believe that this would happen. But if your real target was your domestic political rivals, that makes more sense. I think in many ways you can view the protest against the judicial reform in the same way. I mean, I don't believe that the protesters really thought that the reforms were so terrible, because many of the leaders had said exactly the same thing a few years ago. Yair Lapid stood in front of Kohelet and was basically advocating exactly the same measures. So. Uh, I, and you saw people advocating oligarchy in the name of democracy. None of it rings true, and so I think many of these things have been looked through in the wrong perspective. Perhaps the public might be naive, but I don't think the people who are initiating these measures are naive.
Let's talk about Israel's northern border, if we can, the last few minutes we have together. You've been calling for many years, I believe, for more of an aggressive posture towards Hezbollah. Do you think that it's just a matter of time before there's a war with Hezbollah, or do you think that there are diplomatic options that are open?
Like what, for instance? Unless you believe the Hezbollah are amassing all these rockets just for show, someday you must assume that they're going to use them. And if that's the case, why would you let them choose the time and place to start? I think we should have preempted years ago. I think we just made things worse, especially now with the depletion of our warehouses. What do the Hezbollah want? What do they find? I mean, if you don't recognize the international border, what is the beef with Hezbollah? The Palestinians say, you can say there's an argument, there's a territorial, but what? But what's the territorial dispute with the Hezbollah? It's just our existence. It's not basically across the board, but particularly with the Hezbollah. The source of the conflict is not what the Jews do; it's what the Jews are. And so any solution for them to that is not for them to get them to do something else, but to stop being who they are.
So just to clarify, in terms of what we saw with Hamas and their interest in not arguing over borders, but just killing Jews. And the reason they killed the Jews on the Gaza border is because they couldn't get to, let's say, the Jews like myself in Beit Shemesh. Do you think it's the same mentality in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah, that it's the same idea of let's just kill as much as we can, or is there more strategy behind it?
I'm not sure what strategic objectives there would be apart from that. I mean, they were digging tunnels, or weren't digging tunnels, to smuggle in chips or soft drinks. They were digging tunnels to do exactly what they did in the south. Um, so, I don't know whether I'm 100% right, but that must be our working assumption.
Okay, so you paint a bleak picture, but we need a bleak picture, and we're very difficult times right now. We have a lot of questions coming in from our viewers. So thank you, of course, so much to all of the viewers sending in your questions. So we'll end with a final question. There are in the Middle East some moderate Sunni countries who we have normalized with under the Abraham Accords. Do you see the Abraham Accords as being a substantive change in the perception of the Jewish state, such that it could permeate with our more immediate neighbors, or there's nothing to talk about? Gaza is Gaza, Hezbollah is Hezbollah, and the Abraham Accords can't have any impact?
I don't think the Abraham Accords are going to have an impact on that. I think we paid too high a price for the Abraham Accords. I mean, that's good. It's nice to have it if you can. But first of all, I think that the reason for the Abraham Accords is not any sudden affinity for Zionism, but just the view that Israel was a strong horse, and if Israel is perceived as not being a strong horse, then the Abraham Accords will fall apart. But I think that when we had the choice between extending sovereignty in Judean Samaria or having the Abraham Accords, I think we should have gone for sovereignty, because substantively we had agreements anyway. They just weren't formalized, but there was Israeli presence in the Gulf states, etc., etc. So basically, we paid for giving up sovereignty to formalize something that substantively was already in place. So, I'm very skeptical about the motivation and the strategic. I don't see the Gulf Army mobilizing to come and help the Zionists rebuff some attack by one of its enemies. I don't see that. I certainly don't see the Saudis doing it. It's nice if you can have it, and let's move forward and let's have economic relations, and with what's happening in Saudi and women starting to drive, etc., etc. Maybe incrementally it will become less hostile, but I don't think that should be something that leads our strategy, and I don't think we should pay any prices for it. If they want relations with us, they can have relations. If they don't, they don't.
Dr. Martin Sherman, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time for more briefings. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.